Great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin. This is Nikos RPG, Game Master's Guide, and today we are going to be talking about something that happens quite often during a year. There's inevitably those times when people simply can't make it to their appointed game times, whether it be because of bad weather, disease, happenstance in life. And what do you do when those situations occur? We're going to talk tonight about a bunch of different possibilities and alternatives to allow you to make the game session still a lot of fun for the people that can make it, and also provide you some alternatives on how to salvage the session so it doesn't just go completely south. But before we get to that, make sure you go down below and hit all the buttons so that the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience. And let's get started, shall we? As soon as my button works.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, or strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
You've had it happen before when you just get your games grouped together and it's, half an hour before game start time and players just simply don't show up. You race all through your brain and you try to figure out ways to make the session still happen. You try to consider all the alternatives. Is it, are people that are traveling long distances already on their way, or can it be averted? Many things run through your mind. I'm going to offer a bunch of different ideas on ways that I have in the past avoided or altered or changed the situation so that the session was able to go off without a hitch. Of course, the most common way to avoid such a problem is to reschedule. If you get the announcement early enough and you really don't have any of the alternatives, this is the quickest, easiest, and the least imaginative way at all to do so. You can call it off. Of course, if you're running an ongoing campaign, you lose momentum. If you've done this for a couple of weeks in a row, for example, since this is cough, cold, flu season, we have had people each week not make it, but the difference in each session is that it's a different person that doesn't show up in the case of illness, because the plague, so to speak, works its way through your audience. So if you do this, you are therefore losing weeks of fun and enjoyable times, but you're also preserving the continuity. And because of that, many people look at this as their only alternative. And it is valid. I'm listing it here among them because it is something you can choose to do, but ultimately it does cause a loss of momentum and a need to kind of remember everything that's been going on, so to make sure that you don't miss out any of the details. And inevitably you probably will, but that's just the facts of it. But let's look at some other alternatives that might be more effective. Alright, so the next way you do this is you go ahead and play the session with the people who are there, but you play as if the other person isn't gone. From a GMing standpoint, this fundamentally means you have to find a way to scale the adventure differently, which in effect means you have to handicap the enemy. You have to put a situation into place that explains how their absence won't ruin everything, so to speak. And it does take some imagination to think through this. You have to consider what might have happened had they not made it in the previous episode, or to explain why their portion of the task is still able to be completed although they're not there. And the handicapping of an enemy does leave for those who are there generally a feeling that the game wouldn't have been the same, would have been different had it would have played out differently had that other person been there, and therefore you run a risk of losing some of the credibility that you've worked so hard to build within your games group when you obviously change the scenario to accommodate one player. This undermining doesn't necessarily harm your campaigning in any kind of real sense, but it does suggest there are weaknesses in the mechanism if the world isn't as hard and fast as they might have thought it to be. So the real key to doing your proper handicapping is try to prepare for that alternative in the way you present the narrative, so there's always an alternative for the villains to have gone through that isn't so obvious that the players can feel that change. Then the next alternative is to play as though they're there. That means fundamentally revising the parameters of the game to actually negate what that one persona would have done had they been there. And this provides the opposite problem. Your players begin to feel like they can manipulate and alter the game by simply choosing who to have show up for each session, almost like they're expecting you to change the universe on an instantaneous basis all the time. And that also is problematic because there's no feeling of constancy, there's no feeling of limitation and boundaries in the game because the game master will simply adjust things to make it work. So we have to be careful with when and how often we do this. There are times when it does work out. The most common example is if the party was already heading into a community on a peaceful mission and just were simply going to be doing some barter trade and negotiation. Perhaps the other person's involvement would have only changed the story tangentially, and therefore you can get away with a play as though moment. The difference between the as if and the as though, however, is really important because when you play as if they are there, then you're not changing the story, but you're scaling the encounters appropriately. In this case, you're not scaling the adventure, but instead you're adjusting the parameters, and it's a nuanced difference. But I think when you play a few dozen of these situations, you'll see why they make a difference. I think you're going to find the ones that we're coming to, the next couple, are a lot more viable and a lot more fun ways to do it. All right, so in this case, when you're looking at the adventure, instead of limiting out what you'd already described, or instead of adjusting the player's balance to make the system work, to reinterpret is literally to play without them. It's as if they had never been in the previous scene. Now, this is sort of retcon in a way, but since it's playing over something that hasn't yet played the first time through, it's just simply a reinterpretation. And as long as the players are amenable to it, it can be made to make sense. In other words, you can simply have the very thing that happened in real life occur within the game. And so the persona simply is not up to it or out of sorts or involved in another altercation, and you simply are forced to make a new decision, a new play path that doesn't have them included. And so by reinterpreting the scene as you lead into it, it makes the play feel more natural, more normal, and it is arguably a collective reimagining. And whenever you include others in the creation and the imagination process, of course, they're going to feel better about it, and it's going to be more directly associated with what you're trying to do. Of course, another one of the flat options, just like the reschedule, the next would be substitute. And that means literally you play a completely different game. Perhaps you have a board game that you haven't played in a while, or you've got as you can see, my wide array of different titles I have here over here when the games group gets together and we can't come up with something that's going to be able to appropriately adjust the game situation, we can at least play something else. Now, this isn't much different from the reschedule, except that it does keep the continuity of the games group together and keeps that rhythm pattern so that your players don't feel the start stop that the true reschedule provides. It just keeps the game moving more smoothly overall. Now here's an interesting one. This is, I think, one of the better ones, and that is, rather than completely restructure the encounter as you had built it, perhaps redefine the situation. For example, provide the players with an edge, something that pushed their limited numbers actually into an advantage by adding an element of surprise or adding a locale that is more conducive to the limitations that the players have. When you do this, when you provide them a redefined environment, granted it takes more imagination, you've got to be reaching beyond what you originally designed in order to provide them a way to accomplish this. But when you redefine it in this fashion, then even the players have to recognize that there will be changes in the way that they will have to play, and therefore you haven't had to recreate in any fashion, but instead you are now redefining so that they will have to play perhaps differently, more aggressively, or more passively than they had before. And this is one of my favorite ways to handle the situation. But here is where the genius occurs. Let's go under the assessment that you are playing exactly the same scenario as you originally intended, including all of the danger, all of the potential, and you are playing literally, the players are aware that they are playing as underdogs to the scene. They understand they're short-handed, and they're literally going to be given the alternative ending, and that is to play it without the other person, and then if that is unacceptable or goes horribly, you can always replay the situation. And I find this one really kind of fascinating because it provides for, especially in a world like Nikos, where you can actually drift and adjust from one world to an alternative of that same world within the same framework because time is fractured. This is a great way to accomplish it. So you set up your scenario exactly as you intended. You have all of your triggers in place, and the players, knowing that it's a prepared adventure, knowing that you are on the spot for what they want to accomplish, have to begin to think in terms of what they might do differently in order to accomplish the success, even with the restriction of the players or players being missing. And this really makes for a really imaginative situation. Now, in one case I can remember in particular, the play without the player was a heroic adventure, and the players barely survived. They didn't get to their objective completely. Nonetheless, they did have a really fun time and enjoyed the experience. In the actual play the following week, when they decided to play, as I said, to play the Fable side, and they played the second time through, they were all more aware of the situation, which means they played a little bit more presciently, but it also means that I, as a game master, was aware of what mistakes I had made in the previous week in terms of strategy and tactics for my villain, and ended up with a functional TPK. And so, therefore, in the concept of the fractured fable, they actually chose to keep for the memory and the timeline their first encounter instead of the one where they had the full complement. So there's a lot of alternatives that can really happen with a fractured fable thought process, where you've now created imaginative binary, and the players can choose which of the storylines they wish to keep thereafter. So it's a fun way to play through when there is a need for a handling of a player's unplanned absence. Now, Another alternative, which I haven't really talked about here, is to play the same scenario but play it in an alternate universe. In other words, change the physics, change the dynamics, perhaps exactly the same situation, but now you cast it in a modern setting, provide the characters with their cultural analogs, and they keep the same persona, but now they're playing it in the alternate universe. And that's exactly what the Nikos RPG play mechanism provides for. You have a master book that covers the basic rules, and you also have different genre books that cover the same, could be covering the exact same scene, but in the perspective of a different group of heroes. So just think of that as another possibility, and tie that perhaps into the fractured fable, as if they stepped out of time and had to play the situation in a completely different world. Just something to think about. I do want to thank you for being here. Remember, we're Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. Pacific time every day, every week, and we will see you next time. By the way, as my grandfather would say,